Our next artist is Titian, and Titian was one of the artists of the later Italian Renaissance. So, some of the things that we want to note about Titian for our background information is that he used light and dark shading, light and dark shading to convey emotion. So he oftentimes is going to use different kind of his color choices when he's painting to try and use that to highlight or convey emotion with those colors. Lighter colors, obviously meaning more whimsy and happiness and joy, and darker colors meaning sorrow and grief and mourning and things like that. A second thing that's interesting about Titian is that he used many layers of paint, and he painted with oil paint, many layers of paint to give his work depth. Many layers of paint to give his work depth. Oftentimes, Titian's pieces, if you turn them to the side and looked at them, he most frequently did oil painting on canvas. There might be almost an inch thick of paint where he would just constantly go back over and over again and add more and more paint to his pieces to kind of highlight and build depth within those pieces. So that's a really interesting technique that he started to use. And then the last thing that we want to note is that his subject matter was often stories from Roman/Greek mythology, that were highly sexual in nature, So in a previous artist, we were talking about how, especially early on in the Renaissance, that they were introducing nudity into their pieces, and that a lot of the early Renaissance nudity was much more modest, where here by the later Italian Renaissance, the nudity is much more sexual in nature. So you will see that when we look at some of Titian's pieces. So now we're going to look at two of those pieces. The first one is a piece called Venus of Urbino. And this particular piece is a really interesting one because it is a portrait of a noble woman, so a woman of wealthy society of that time. And she is modeled after the goddess Venus. So this is kind of a play on the goddess Venus. Like if you think back to the Birth of Venus piece that we saw, this woman is supposed to kind of mirror her characteristics and her traits. And what's interesting about this particular piece is she has what would be a very intriguing stare. She's looking directly out at the audience, which we talked about before was a rarity in this time period, similar to the Mona Lisa. So she's intriguingly staring at the audience. And in the piece, she's pictured waiting in her bed while her servants are getting her dress or ready, or kind of in the background you can see that they are picking out her outfit for that day. Now, what's interesting about this particular piece is, just as kind of an interesting note, that many of the individuals of this time period, as you can notice about this woman, even if we didn't know who she was, we could probably figure out that she was a woman of wealthier status, one, because she was having her portrait painted, and two, because she has two physical characteristics that were common of people that were of the upper classes of that time period. One is the fact that she is fairer in complexion. Oftentimes, what was interesting in kind of contrast to today's society and attitudes about beauty is it was considered very attractive for women and men to both be have almost like porcelain skin, very, very pale skin, because it meant that they had enough wealth that they didn't need to be outside doing physical labor, where those that were of the lower classes were usually the ones that were out in the sun working and doing those types of physically strenuous jobs. So having fair skin was a sign of wealth and beauty in that time. And additionally, the other thing about her that was a signal of wealth and beauty is the fact that she's a little bit more curvy. And that was something that was a sign, because if you could have hearty meals and feed yourself regularly, then that was also because you had the money and access to food to do those types of things. So being a little bit more kind of curvy and then being fair was considered a virtue of that time, and a highly regarded beauty trait. So that's kind of interesting. And you can see in this piece, there's a lot of interesting details. You can see kind of the curtain that's draped behind her, and it looks like a nice soft velvet. You can see she's laying on her bed. She's holding a bunch of flowers in her hand. In the background on the far right, you can see there's a little dog laying on her bed, which would also be a sign of status to be able to afford to have a pet. So definitely there's a lot of little kind of hints here about who this woman would be and her status, as well as kind of the detail that Titian used in painting these figures. So that is Venus of Urbino. And then the second piece that we're going to look at by him is called Diana and Callisto. Now, this particular piece is telling the story from Roman mythology. And this is supposed to be showing the story of the goddess Diana, who's pictured there in the center. And she's reaching out her hand and pointing very accusatorily towards her maid, Callisto, who is on the ground, surrounded by the other figures. And the story is that this is moments after Diana discovers Callisto is pregnant by her father. And her father, Diana's father, was Jupiter or Zeus. And what's interesting about this particular story, we've talked about before how oftentimes in religion, the stories that are told help kind of rationalize different things that are hard to explain. And how with Roman mythology, a lot of things that we understand now because of science, they had to explain using their religion. And so this story is that after Diana discovers that Callisto is pregnant with basically Diana's father's child, she banishes her out into the woods. And that Diana eventually gives birth to the child, Callisto eventually gives birth to the child. And that when Diana discovers that then the child and Callisto are living out in the woods, Diana was the goddess of the hunt. You can see that many of the other maidens around her are holding bows and arrows, which is a symbol that's associated with Diana. And so she took her bow and arrow and basically wanted to go and hunt down Callisto and her child. And that Jupiter, to protect them, turned them into bears and then put them into the sky to keep them safe from Diana so she couldn't hurt them. And that particular story is where we get the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, which are the names for the Big and Little Dipper, which are supposed to represent bears as those constellations and heavenly bodies. So that's kind of where that story was supposed to be able to explain those two constellations. So it's just kind of an interesting tale. And this particular piece, Diana and Callisto, is supposed to be highlighting the events kind of leading up to that parable and that story. So we have Diana discovering Callisto, her maid, is pregnant by her father, Jupiter. And that is kind of, we're seeing the reactions of these characters and figures. So you can see kind of the interesting details that Titian put into these pieces, from all of kind of the figures and their facial expressions to his careful attention to the female nude figure. In the very front of the painting, you can see the dog that he put there, and then it's just kind of encompassing all of these rich colors and the contrast of the light and dark coloring within these pieces. So that is our pieces by Titian. And next we're going to look at our last artist, which is Donatello.